Well, good morning, friends. Good to see all those warm handshakes. It is finally warmer out there. Love it. Welcome here. If you're new with us, my name is Paul, and I have the honor of being the lead pastor here at Lakeview. And today we continue our series, Jesus the King. Now, throughout this series, we've been journeying through broadly, but we have been journeying through the Gospel of Mark, where Mark boldly proclaims news. He's boldly proclaiming news that the King has arrived. And he makes this declaration. Mark consistently points us in this news to Jesus. The King is here, and it's Jesus. In fact, as we read the Gospel and as we encounter Jesus' work, we can come away with those who saw Jesus' work asking the question, who is this man? Because he's doing such incredible things. And Mark continuously answers this with conviction. He is the King, revealed in Jesus' words of authority, his miraculous healings, and his transformative teaching. There's this consistent pointing by Mark to Jesus and his authority. He is the King. Now today we are nearing the end of both the series and Mark's gospel, and we find ourselves at the heart of the Christian story. But before we just jump into it, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely lost, with no idea to even, how to even begin to find your way out? It seemed hopeless, confusing. You just didn't know where to turn. You didn't know if there was even any hope. Have you ever found yourself in a space like that? About 24 years ago, Jessica and I went on a missions trip to Ukraine. We were newly married, and it was an opportunity for us to serve. As well, it was an opportunity for Jessica to kind of see the country I was born in, and for me, it was also an opportunity to serve, but also to go back to where I was born. It was been about 10 years since I was there, so I wanted to go back to help out, to serve, but also see my country. Now, on that missions trip, for part of it, we were in the city called Sumy, which is northern Ukraine, kind of close to the Russian border. And it was during a time when the country, was 10 years out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, so it's struggling economically. There was a financial downfall. There's general poverty. And because of that, electrical power, for example, was routinely shut off at night to save electricity. Hot running water was very scarce, or just even running water sometimes was very scarce. The situation was pretty rough. And at that time, the country itself still hadn't rejuvenated in any way because of economical downfall. So everything still was that old Soviet era, concrete buildings everywhere. And even though during Soviet era they were upkept, now for 10 years, everything was kind of left decaying. It looked pretty bleak. The buildings were very similar. The blocks would just repeat themselves over and over in identical patterns for large parts of the city. It was very confusing and pretty bleak, and it was just a lot of concrete everywhere. All looked the same. Now, during our time in Sumy, we were kind of in two teams, just based on where you can find accommodations for us. And so I was visiting one of the teams, while my team was another part of the city, and it was a lengthy walk in between the two places. But I kind of had the language and the context, and I was like, okay, I'll visit this team. And visiting was going really great because my wife was with that female team, so it was good to see her and visit with her. And so I was kind of taking my time, not wanting to go home quite or go back to my other place quite yet. But it was getting dark, and I was thinking, I don't really know this city, and everything kind of looks the same. Maybe I should get going back. But we were having a lot of fun together, so we were hanging out, and finally I said, okay, it's kind of getting dark. I better get going. So I started walking home, and it got way darker than I expected. It was just pretty dark in the city, and I was walking all by myself, and then out of the blue, all the electricity was shut off. You literally heard that, that sound. You could hear it, and everything, all the windows, all the lights, all the street lights, everything went pitch black, and it was just dark. Top of it is kind of overcast, so there's not even maybe the stars can kind of guide me, or the moon. Nope, couldn't see it, all super dark, and then you have these gray buildings in the same way, all look identical, so you can't see for a few feet ahead of you. I was completely lost. I was already on the way before the power, truth be told. Before the power went out, I was already kind of is this the right way? I'm not really sure, everything's looking the same. And now it's completely dark, I'm completely lost, the streets are eerily quiet. There was also wild dogs just running around everywhere, roaming. And if I'm honest, people were in a desperate, tough place. So having a few American dollars on you kind of put me at risk as a target. There's no cell phones at this time, no way to communicate. I am utterly disorientated. And I've never felt that way before or after. I wandered the streets, unsure if I would find shelter or even safety. Every street looked the same. Every corner I turned was like, did I just come from there? What is happening here? Why is everything's the same? And I started to begin to make plans where where would I hunker for the night? Like, what looks safe? Where could I kind of be in the corner, away from like the dogs, and hopefully nobody kind of sees me to bother me? Like, I'm making these kind of plans. And it was a super weird feeling: powerlessness, hopelessness, disorientation, fearfulness. And it was hard because, honestly, at that time on this trip, I was used to taking charge. I was the one who had language. I could speak Ukrainian and Russian. I had cultural understanding. I still had enough memory, even though I was little when I left, of like, okay, this is how things work. And if I'm really honest, the young Paul felt pretty confident in himself. I was athletic, I was strong, I was young, I knew better than everyone else. So it was weird to be in this moment where everything's so dark and hopeless and you're just feeling disoriented and you can't trust yourself. You can't trust where to go. And so all this confusion and frustration and hopelessness and even anger begins to settle in. Now, I don't know if you've ever found yourself in that kind of predicament, but I wager many of us have experienced moments of uncertainty and disorientation. Maybe it was when you lost a job, or your career path took an unexpected turn and suddenly the future felt unclear. Or maybe it was when you received difficult news, a diagnosis, a fractured relationship, an unexpected loss, and it felt like the ground beneath you shifted. These moments where everything was familiar all of a sudden fade, and you're left feeling powerless and unsure of the way around. These moments are hard and dark and vulnerable. And today, we find ourselves in that kind of moment. In that kind of moment for Jesus and his disciples. We read, "Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes and threw dice to decide who would get each piece. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, 'The King of the Jews.' 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left." Now, if you remember, as we've been saying all along and the way I started today, Mark in this gospel has been building for us a clear declaration that there is good news because the King is here. But now, as we move toward the end of the story of this gospel, Jesus is ironically mocked by the same title, the King of the Jews. You see, those who followed Jesus and even those who were angered or against him did not miss the proclamation that the disciples and Mark and Jesus' actions were making, that he is the King. And now, as he's crucified, they jeer him with the same title. The people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. "Ha! Look at you now," they yelled at him. "You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Well then, save yourself and come down from the cross." The leading priests and teachers of religious law also mocked Jesus. "He saved others," they scoffed, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross so we can see it and believe him." Even the men who were crucified with Jesus ridiculed him. Imagine the anguish Jesus, his followers, disciples, all who followed him must have felt as they stood near the cross, watching the man they had followed for years now suffer and die. This was the one who calmed the storms, right? Who had that authority. The one who healed the sick. and even defied death with a mere word. Even just days earlier to this, he had entered Jerusalem to cheers of crowds welcoming him as a king. Now, as Christians, we too try to make sense of this whole situation, don't we? We read these kind of things, and we try to make sense of it. We've built theological systems or ways of studying and understanding God to make sense of this moment. And honestly, rightly so. If we were to take our faith seriously, the cross actually demands a lifetime of contemplation and reflection on the cross, because it pushes against all our sensibilities of life. So we try to understand and we wrestle with it. And then to add to this moment of confusion and disorientation, Mark tells us that at noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Now, I want to linger in this verse today. It is tempting for me to move on to the contrast of light that will appear and make sense of the cross and go back to those theologies that we have developed to understand God and say, yes, but look, this is what happens. But I think for today, for this story of the Jesus the King and his authority, it's important for us to just linger here. We'll get to the hope part. We'll certainly will next week. But today I want us to stay here in this uncomfortable, disorientating moment. So can I invite you, especially if you have been a long church attender, or if you've read the Bible or you're a Bible reader, to begin to explain this moment in your head. To not jump ahead in the story and make sense of it and already be articulating everything that's going to happen, but just to stay here, to linger in this darkness. Mark and the other gospel writers want us to note that this darkness happened. So much so that Mark is very precise with the time of the day that this happens, right? And wants us to see the contrast of sudden darkness during the day. Rembrandt, in his famous image of the crucifixion, captures the contrast beautifully, creating depth and setting and mood. And so does Mark in his writing. Mark goes on to great lengths to show us that the defining moments of Jesus' death take place in darkness. In fact, everything leading to this moment has been done in darkness. His betrayal was in the dark. His trial unfolded at night. But even now, in the middle of the day, as he hangs on the cross, an unexplainable darkness descends. Mark wants us to see this divine act. He says, at noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. So from 12 to 3 in the afternoon, as Jesus was dying, there was total darkness. Now, many people have proposed natural causes for this event, where there was an eclipse, for instance. But honestly, solar eclipses are usually like just for a moment. This is 3 hours, so what's really happening here? Some have said that, maybe it was a storm, that like there's these storms that would come up and they would cover the sky for days, and maybe that's what happened. But honestly, the timing of the season doesn't allude to those places because it's Passover. So first we know it's full moon, so it's not an eclipse. And because it's Passover, we know it's usually the wet season, so the desert storm isn't likely be happening here. But the point isn't to say, well, this is exactly what happened or didn't happen. The point, Mark wants us to notice that there's this mystery. There's this mystery of the darkness, and then there's a disorientation that happens in it. Mark wants us, and he's inviting us to feel the confusion and fear. There hangs the King of the Jews, and the land goes dark. Now, it's one thing to get lost in the city, as I did, in the dark, and lights go out, and it's kind of fearful. But it's another, darkness disorients us even if we expect it. When our kids were little, we would camp everywhere. And one of our camping trips, we went to Lewis and Clark Caverns. And we climbed, and we had to pass this test. Can you hike this distance in this amount of time? And if you can do it, then you're of good health that you can go through these caverns, and there's ups and downs. It was really fun. And so we did that, and our boys were little then, and so we're climbing through the caves, and they get us to one of the deepest parts of the mountain in this tunnel. And there's quite a bit of room, and we all stand there, and there's there's electricity there, so there's some little lights. And then they say, we're going to turn it off. We're going to turn off the lights. So be ready. And they actually invite us to step away. The kids are right with me, Jessica's there, and kind of people are huddling, and they say, you should take a step away from each other. Just allow the darkness to fill. And then they turn the lights off. And they told us, wave your hand in front of you. You can't see anything, and it's so dark. And they don't do it for too long because it actually becomes disorientating. It actually becomes frightening and actually causes panic in some people. And then all of a sudden they turn the lights on, and it feels weird. You actually, where you thought your kids were for a second, all of a sudden it feels like they're a little bit off, and you're like, well, maybe they were moving, and you thought, oh, I was there. Like, it just throws you off. The darkness just creates disorientation. And to stay in utter darkness for an extended time can have radical effects on our mental health. We know this. We know people who live more up north at a certain time. In Sweden, they have the sun lamps that they've created. People need to go in the sunrooms and get more light because it's just too hard on our mental health. It confuses and unsettles us. And we see it in Mark's story. The bewilderment of Jesus' followers, the onlookers, and even his disciples is unmistakable. Is this the king? Why does he seem so powerless? Darkness filled the land. But amid the darkness of confusion, disorientation, and lost identity, Mark wants us to see that even there, in that moment, that the cross becomes the place where Jesus reveals God. It is at the cross where Jesus is reshaping and renewing our understanding of true authority. Everyone till the cross expected authority to be exercised as it always has been. Might is right. To be victorious meant taking power by sword, tank, missile, drone. This is how kingdoms work. If you want to win, you act with might. This is how kings act. The world as a whole still runs on this same principle. The might is right. Now, can we be honest for a second? When I say this, you can make some arguments of like, well, yeah, but this is justified, this isn't justified. And we'd like to pretend that we're actually more civilized than just, we'll just send tanks and drones. We like to pretend we're more civilized. But again and again, not least in our own century, we have seen that when the chips are down, we revert to the same rule. If in doubt, send the tanks. And the trouble is that it sometimes works. And this band of this first century disciples were looking to Jesus to spearhead the whole operation. And spearhead maybe is the operative word here. To use his authority as the king to win. What is he doing hanging on the cross in the dark? Mark wants us to see that Jesus on the cross reveals God in an absolutely unexpected way, showing us a different movement in authority to vulnerability. And a way in the world that flips all that we deem powerful upside down. And Jesus, honestly, has been preparing his disciples for this moment. He's been preparing us all the way through the Gospel of Mark for this moment. Look what he taught us and the disciples earlier. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. The truth that our God is servant king, if we're honest, can be disorientating. We might say it, but when life gets hard, when things go wrong, when we find ourselves in the darkness and disorientation, we want a victorious God, one who will crush our enemies and fix everything. That's the God, that's the King who's easy to proclaim. But a dying, vulnerable, serving God, even if we acknowledge it, living out that truth is far more difficult than we'd like to admit. It's even natural for us when we serve to serve when there's benefits. But what about when it costs us? When there's no immediate benefit, reward, or relief? It is in those moments it can feel like darkness, confusion, disorientation, and even hopelessness. It stretches our understanding to grasp, it stretches our understanding to grasp that we are set free by someone who became powerless, strengthened by someone who embraced weakness, and given hope by someone who let go of all the status and privilege. Simply, as Christians, we are invited to follow a leader who chose to become a servant, who chose to use his authority in vulnerability. This defies both our intellect and emotions, if we're honest, because we see a different kind of power at work in our world. But here's the beauty and the power of the cross. When we allow the disorientation to focus us, when we see the cross, when it becomes the focal point, the center of our hope, when we find ourselves in life's darkest moments in our vulnerability, the cross seems to actually offer hope. Vulnerability actually seems to heal. Let me give you some examples. When we long for freedom, we might seek it from someone who's never been imprisoned, but how much more freeing it is to be led by someone who was captive like us, yet now walks in freedom. When we crave healing, we might turn to someone untouched by suffering, but how much more comforting it is to be held by someone who has felt our pain and carries our scars. When we search for direction, we might look for someone who's never been lost, but how much more life-giving it is to be guided by someone who has wandered and been found. This is precisely why the cross in the darkness, that emptying that happens to Jesus, is exactly where Jesus meets us. Not above our struggles, but right in the heart of them. Friends, when we begin to understand this, that is at the center of our pain is exactly where God meets us. Then, and finally then, we begin to understand this king's confusing invitation. Then calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, "If any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me." Take up your cross and follow me. Jesus said this way before he's on the cross. And it's hard. It's hard to understand it. Following Jesus means stepping into his way of life, giving up my own way, my own authority. Jesus, follow me, because the Son of Man came to serve and not be served. And so he invites this invitation and extends it to us to embrace a life of servanthood, to follow him. But let me make this clear before we go on any further. This radical servanthood isn't a backdoor strategy for success. It's not a clever path to influence or a subtle way to seize control. I'll just do this, I'll serve, and boy, people will notice me. Or if I do this, this will propel me. This will give me currency in my volunteer work. Instead, it's about learning, like Jesus, to empty ourselves, to release our grip rather than to cling, to choose service over dominance, and to trust that true life is found in surrender. And honestly, servanthood at times feels like it doesn't make sense, especially if it's not for our benefit, or especially if things just don't move forward, right? It can be frustrating when you're serving and you're helping, but things are just not getting better. People are kind of still staying in the same place. You're like, what am I doing this for? Should I even help? Like, nothing's changing. And this is the paradox of the cross, because it's not a strategy. It only begins to make sense when we see it as the path to encounter God. It's not a hidden tactic for authority. It is the way we come face to face with God. When we recognize God at the heart of servanthood, we are moved beyond simply helping the unfortunate. Servanthood, friends, is an encounter with a gracious God who transcends distinctions like wealth and poverty, success and failure. It is not about immersing ourselves in misery, but about living joyfully with the vision of a God revealed in and through vulnerability and service. Friends, the poor are blessed not because poverty is good. They're blessed because they meet God there. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Mourners are now blessed. Mourners are blessed not because mourning is good, but because they will be comforted, because they will meet Jesus there. Service then is not just a means for social change, but a search for God. And this is where the paradox lies. When service is driven by desires for change, for revolution, it can actually fade. Without visible results, success, or praise, our motivation begin to wane. We begin to question ourselves. Is this doing any good? What am I doing? I'm just spinning my wheels. But servanthood pushes us to persist. Radical servanthood pushes us to persist, revealing God's gracious presence in our broken world. Even when we face ongoing hardships, even when things are not getting better, maybe better said, especially in the vulnerability of darkness. And so we linger in this uncomfortable moment this Sunday, staying in the darkness of the cross. And what we see is that it is here, in that moment of darkness and defeat, in that moment, Jesus exposes the powers and principalities of this world and defeats them. Friends, the Christian journey is disorientating at times. Some of our best efforts sometimes fail by the standards of this world. It can feel frustrating and upsetting and disorientating. And in that darkness, we are left wondering, maybe I just need to fight fire with fire. Enough is enough. After all, that kind of power actually gets results. All this I'm doing and nothing's changing. But in the mystery of the cross, when darkness fills the land, and as it begins to lift, Jesus doesn't cry out, I did it. Jesus cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? When he's emptied, when all is lost, in the mystery of that moment, an amazing moment of grace occurs. It's a defeat. It's not a victory. An amazing moment occurs. The last person any of us would expect to be moved by all this is moved. It's not the disciples who have heard Jesus teach over and over, and they hear this and they're moved by it and they understand and they put all the pieces together. No, they're disorientated. It's not the women that follow Jesus everywhere. It's not the religious leaders who would have known the prophetic words of Psalm 22 or the prophecy of darkness that was revealed in Amos. None of them are moved. Mark shows us that it's the hardened centurion, a man of war, authority, power, strength, who has witnessed countless crucifixions. A man who would have, in his station, a centurion, would have proclaimed that Caesar is the Son of God, that Caesar is king. It is he who observes all of this mystery of the cross, the authority and vulnerability. And at that moment in darkness, as it lifts and Jesus cries out these words of abandonment, it is the centurion who declares, this man truly was the Son of God. It is in the depth of darkness that the centurion met God. It's hard to explain it. I was reading a whole bunch of commentaries just on this one part, and so many people, as they come to this, so many theologians, when they come to this part, they go, I've spent 30, 40, I've spent a lifetime understanding what did he witness that made him proclaim this audacious news that this man is truly the king. So this week, this Sunday, I want to invite you to linger in this moment. It'd be easy to jump ahead. Our spiritual practice of contemplative reading will be in Mark 15. We'll start in verses 24, and it'll work our way right to verse 34. And I want to invite you to read those over and over, to place yourself in that darkness, the mystery, the confusion, the space with no answers. And what is it in that vulnerability of God with all authority that causes this bystander to proclaim that Jesus is Lord? I want us to linger in that darkness. We're invited to reflect on how Jesus' kingship subverts our expectation and invites us to meet God in our lowest moments, in our vulnerability. Jesus reveals to us that true authority isn't about grasping for power, but about sacrificial, vulnerable love. So what does it mean for us? It means that our own moments of disorientation, confusion, and loss, we can trust that that's actually where we meet Jesus. Not with quick fixes, not with quick solutions and strategies, but we meet his presence. Now, in a moment, we'll respond with song about the amazing grace that meets us in our pain and vulnerability and in our confusion and disorientation, that God meets us with all of his beauty and grace. But before we do that, can I invite you to ask a couple of questions of yourself? The slide won't be there for too long, so if you want to take a snapshot, you can. These questions will be in your home church guide as well. But can I invite you to ask these questions? Where is Jesus reshaping my understanding of power, success, or control in order to meet me? And how might I choose to embody his way of humble, self-giving love in my life this week? Let me say that again. Where is Jesus reshaping my understanding of power, success, or control in order to meet me? And how might I choose to embody his way of humble, self-giving love in my life this week? Let me pray. God, we thank you that you do what we cannot do. You told the rich young ruler that with humans this is impossible, with God this is possible. And so you go on the cross, and with all your authority, you vulnerably succumb to defeat and death. And in that, you meet us as the one who understands and who knows us. God, help us to linger in this space this week and encounter you in ways perhaps we haven't done so before. Give us courage and wisdom to do that. I pray these things in your name. Amen. Amen.